Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, 5 Critical Job Interview Mistakes That Keep You from Landing a BA Job. I'm your host, Marlena Lombardi, and on behalf of IIBA, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to learn more on what we can do or not do in our next BA interview. Today's webinar represents one way IIBA provides the BA community information and tools to start or kickstart a BA career. It is designed to deliver practical resources and advice for you, the BA practitioner, as you continue to hone your skill set. At IIBA, we are all about uniting a community of professionals, and we are all here today to learn more on how we can prepare for our next BA interview. Today, we are welcoming back our presenter, Laura Brandenburg, who is an internationally recognized leader known for helping mid-career professionals start business analysis careers. As an author, presenter, and coach, she'll help you find transferable business analysis skills, expand your business analysis experience, and start your business analysis career with confidence. And today, Laura is here to do just that by helping us understand the 5 critical job interview mistakes that keep us from landing a BA job. Please welcome Laura Brandenburg.
Well, thank you so much, Marlena and IIBA, for having me here. It's always wonderful to support IIBA and the membership and the BA community at large through these webinars, so thank you. I just wanted to start by sharing 2 stories. So as Marlena mentioned, I have been a hiring manager in the past. I've been a business analyst. I've been a consultant, I've been a contractor, right? So I've seen this hiring perspective from hiring process from a couple of different perspectives. But these 2 stories are from my experience as a hiring manager, where I interviewed dozens of BAs as part of building a BA team from scratch. And one woman I was interviewing, she had years of experience in business analysis, but not a lot of recent experience in the tools and techniques we are using right now in our organization. Her answers to my questions were really vague, and I was having trouble just figuring out if she really knew everything. She kind of had all the right words, but I was just not getting that confidence that she would be able to show up and do the things that she said she could do based on her resume. So after kind of asking some indirect questions and trying to get her to share a little bit more about her experience, finally I just asked her straight out, could you please give me a specific example of, X? And I think the question was like a time you had the stakeholder change their mind about the requirements, or some common challenge, that we would expect a BA to understand or have experience with. And her answer was like, oh dear, I've been doing this for so long, I really can't remember these specific examples. And so I just want you to think, do you think that she was the person that was hired? And now let me tell you another story. And this woman also didn't have a lot of recent experience in the tools that we were using. She actually didn't have a lot of recent business analysis experience. She'd taken several years off to care for her aging parents, and she was re-entering the workforce. She was contracting as a quality assurance professional, but that was not really what she wanted to be doing in her job. And so we talked mostly about her business analysis experience from 5, maybe it was even like 10 years back. And she gave me specific examples of the work she did, the projects she oversaw, the challenges she overcame. She spoke about the documentation she created, and in our conversation, I had completely forgot that this work experience was from several years ago, and she made it feel like this was the work that she was doing yesterday or like that morning in her job. And do you think she was hired? She was, and she became one of the best BAs I had on my team. And here's the thing, on paper, that first woman was more qualified. She had more recent work experience, more depth of work experience, more formal experience. The BA I hired actually didn't have as much formal experience. And she also had a college education that the second person lacked. But it didn't matter because I couldn't get confident about her skills through the interview process. And her demeanor, when she kind of threw that question back at me, definitely didn't speak to being the kind of proactive, detail-oriented, and friendly BA I wanted to hire either. And so this is just, these 2 stories I wanted to open by sharing them as an example of how making some of these critical mistakes that we're going to talk about in the webinar today can really cost you an offer, even if you are the most qualified, the most experienced, the most credentialed candidate that hiring manager talks to, and you could actually be the right person for the job. How you choose to show up in the interview and how you share things in the interview can really affect that outcome in an important way, and we're going to unpack some of the mistakes and some of the successes. Mistakes from the first story and successes from the second. So before we jump into that, I did want to share just a little bit more about what I do and why I'm here. So Marlena gave me that wonderful introduction. I am the owner and CEO of Bridging the Gap, which is a virtual training organization, and we focus specifically on helping business analyst professionals or mid-career professionals get started in business analyst careers. You can find my book, How to Start a Business Analyst Career, on Amazon. We also have several template toolkits and virtual courses that are endorsed both by IIBA and PMI for the professional credits you might need for certification. And there are a ton of free resources on our website, in particular a career planning course and an interview prep guide, which I'm going to share a link to at the bottom, and I think they might be able to share in the chat box as well as just a ton of articles to dig into some of the concepts we're going to talk about today further. If you go to the home page, just click I'm looking for a BA job, and that's where the highlighted resources are on that. And I always like to talk too about our career roadmap, and so this is a map that I've put together that shows like how people get started in a business analyst career. And today we're talking both about getting started, but you might also have a lot of business analysis experience and be looking to just find that next business analyst job. That is the kind of work that happens over on this left side of the roadmap. So a lot of people that come into Bridging the Gap and our programs, they're currently employed in an office setting and have some experience, or they're not employed in an office setting and they're really kind of looking to either get into their first BA job or into a transitional role, and the kinds of things we'll talk about today with interviewing are obviously part of that work. Over on the right side is more for people who are in an office setting and looking to expand that role into a business analyst role. And there is a complete, if you go to the free course section of our website, a complete walkthrough of this roadmap. It's about 45 minutes long, so we don't have time to do that today. But I like to mention that because it is a resource that can kind of help you figure out your next step, whether that's interviewing or your resume or your skills assessment, or just using the skills you have to expand your experience and qualify for more jobs. But let's go into these mistakes that I see most often when I was hiring business analysts. The first, not sharing specific examples. The second, not understanding the terminology. There's a lot of different ways we can translate terminology within business analysis, and I'll share some examples of how you can translate your work, and the terms don't have to be exactly right. So you want to be really flexible with your terminology and know how to translate the terminology that you use so that you can actually position your experience as relevant for a specific job posting. And not asking clarifying questions. As analytical minds, we can kind of just think like we've got to understand it the first time, otherwise we're not going to get it right. And actually one of the best things that we can do in an interview is clarify the questions that are being asked of us so that we can answer the question that's being asked and share the experience that we have. Not asking follow-up questions. So at the end of the interview, usually you're given opportunity to ask some questions of your interviewer, and definitely something you want to be doing as a business analyst. We'll talk more about that. And finally, being unprepared for the very first question that most of us receive, which is, tell me about yourself. And what I find is if you don't have an answer to this question, I know when I was interviewing and I didn't yet have an answer to this question, I would kind of start rambling and get off kilter before things even got started. So we'll talk about some approaches for being really prepared for that question and how to make sure you're using it to your advantage. And we are going to have time for Q&A. So I think between like mistakes 3 and 4, we'll stop and take a few questions there, and then time at the end as well. So go ahead and get those into the chat box as they come up, and Marlena will bring up as many as we can, and we'll go through as many as we can for you. Okay, so this first example, or the first mistake of not sharing specific examples, and this is by far the biggest mistake I see. In the work that I do with Bridging the Gap, people all the time are asking me to share lists of interview questions, and they want the answers to those questions. Like, tell me how should I answer this particular interview question? And there's no possible way that I could answer that question on your behalf. Business analysis interviews aren't like technical interviews. It's not that the interviewer just wants to know that you know what a specific skill is or what a specific technique is. I mean, sometimes that might be the question they ask. They might ask, you know, what is a wireframe, or what is a UML diagram, or what is a use case? They might ask those questions because they don't really know that what they want to really hear is experience. And it's the experience, and especially this experience handling really challenging situations, that often helps that interviewer go from like feeling like you know what to do with the job to feeling like you could step in and make an impact right away. So, you know, and some of those experiences are like challenging stakeholders, changing requirements, getting people to show up to your meetings, handling reviews. What do you do if two stakeholders disagree about requirements? Things like that. It's like they're looking for that ability for you to jump in right away. And you talking about your experience handling those situations in the past is going to do a lot more to prove to them that you're ready to start that job than you say memorizing answers that you find on the internet about what a specific technique is or what a specific skill is. It demonstrates, again, you're demonstrating you do know what that technique is, but also that you have experience using it. And that experience tends to bring to light those softer skills that are really, they're hard to interview for, and they're hard to ask questions around. And so as candidates, we can really help our organization or help our hiring manager by sharing those examples. So one of your favorite prompts you want to have in an interview, and this is a prompt for you, is just the word "for example." So I'm going to share a for example. So say somebody did ask you that question, you know, what is a workflow diagram? You could say, you know, workflow diagram is a visual model that shows a step-by-step process. For example, when I was at this organization or working on this project, I created workflow diagrams as part of an initiative to understand the as-is processes. You know, I must have worked with like nearly a dozen stakeholders across a few different departments. I think accounting and human resources and sales were involved. And I helped them see where some of the gaps were in their processes so they can work together more effectively. Now, of course, that might not be your answer because the departments might have been different, the number of processes might have been different, the way you used it might have been different. And that's why when you're out on the internet, you can't find the right answer, quote unquote, to your specific, how you would answer that question. You need to fill in those blanks and those details with your specific experience. But you see how just that example is richer in more detail and how you'd be like, oh yeah, this person really has done workflow diagrams. And the other thing that kind of answer does is it's probably going to prompt your interviewer to ask you another question that's relevant to that. So, oh, hey, so tell me about, you know, more about how you got those three different departments working together. Or if they're really more tool motivated, they might say, hey, could you tell me what tool did you use? But now you have a conversation going about your experience, and at the end of that interview, the manager is going to leave much more in tune with what you can actually bring to the table as a business analyst than if you had just stopped with, oh, you know, a workflow diagram is a visual model that shows the step-by-step of a process, and there's activity boxes and triangles for decisions, and you can create them in Visio. You know, if you'd gone on and on about the what, they probably wouldn't have felt as good as they did because you jumped into that example. And just a note here is that a lot of interviewers are not going to ask for these examples. A lot of people who interview BAs don't actually really understand what they want out of a BA and don't know how to ask those questions. But still, it's okay to share those examples and make sure that you're speaking to your experience in the interview. Okay, so let's talk about terminology here because I used a specific term, wireframe, in that, or workflow diagram, I think in that example. Wireframe is one I want to talk about here because I had somebody join my use cases and wireframes course. And in the first Q&A session that we had, he had brought up, he's like, you know, I was just at an interview last week and they asked me if I knew how to do wireframes. And I told them no, and that's why I'm in your course, because I wanted to learn how to do them. It kept me from getting the job. And he's like, but now that I'm going through the course materials, I realized that I did these, I just called them mock-ups. And he's like, could I have really spoken to that example in the interview? Like, would it have been a wrong thing to bring up? I was like, not at all, right? So you're like, wireframe is one of those examples where like mock-ups, prototypes, user interface rendering, like there's a dozen words probably that you can use to describe wireframe. And wireframe is not like the only right word, like they're all right words. And so the terms that might come up in an interview might not be the terms that you used when you talked about the work that you did. And so if you make that mistake of kind of not understanding the terminology and not understanding the breadth of your experience and how that relates to the job posting, you could end up saying you don't have experience doing something or not bring up a relevant example when you really do have experience doing something. Now, a few of the things you can do to try to avoid this situation is, analyzing those terms that are in the job description in advance and looking for, looking for your relevant and parallel experience to that. And it's okay to share that experience as relevant. Just be really specific about what you did and clarify, is this the kind of thing that you're looking for? This is what I've done in the past. Would this be relevant in your environment? And you can, again, have that conversation about how your experience fits to the job qualifications. Another way is to just generally familiarize yourself with the terminology. The technique section of the BABOK, the Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, offered to you by IIBA, is a great resource for that. Other books on the fundamentals are great resources for that. We have a whole section on this in my book, How to Start a BA Career, as well. So just kind of consistently looking at the literature and how people are using the terms in context. I also recommend looking at the LinkedIn profiles of the people, both the people you're interviewing with, but if you can also see other people who are filling that role that you're hiring for in the organization, what are the terms they use? Because the terms they use to talk about their job may not be the same terms in the job description, but it may be the terms that are more used in the organization in terms of organization conversations. And those are probably the terms that are going to come up in the interview, may not be right from the job posting. So you really want to look at a lot of different avenues to come up with those terms. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick sip of water and we'll talk about mistake number 3. Another thing I wanted to talk about here before we go on to number 3 is whether or not formal experience is really required, right? So I gave that example, the second woman I interviewed, that her experience wasn't as formal as what we were doing in our organization. And our organization wasn't super crazy formal, but we were using use cases and wireframes and things like that. And she had never created use cases before, that second woman I hired. But she was able to walk me through how she had used visual models, like user interface models, and how she had essentially documented the kind of content that would go into the use case as annotations on those visual models. And so I could see by interviewing her that she was going to be able to put that kind of information together, and that, yes, we would have to show her what a use case was and train her on how to do a use case, but she already had the core use case thinking skills that were needed to really be successful in the job. And it's because she was willing to walk me through that level of detail of exactly what she had put into her prior documentation that I could make that connection, and I was confident in her being able to step in and be successful in the organization. And again, she wasn't saying, hey, I've got experience with use cases. She wasn't trying to mislead me. She was walking me through a similar process. And so that's another way that we can share our experience and relate the terminology to what we've done before. So she, I don't know exactly what question I asked her that triggered that, but she was able to share I've done the functional requirements, right, by documenting them in this way. And so even if the words that you find or are being asked for in an interview aren't the specific things you've done, the closest that you can get to that experience, it's still worth sharing. So it's always better to share something that is partially relevant rather than just saying, oh, no, I've never done that, which I've had people say, right? She could have said that, oh, have you ever written use cases? Oh, no, I haven't. And maybe you say, I've never written a use case, but I looked up what a use case is, and what I've done in my past is I've kind of done a lot of the work that's in the use case through these kinds of visual models, and then kind of writing walking your interviewer through that detail. And so that's the other benefit of doing the research on the terminology and understanding what they're asking for. So let's look at the third mistake, which is not asking or not clarifying unclear questions. Because this can come up. You can do a lot of research ahead of time, but then maybe somebody throws a term at you that you haven't heard before. I've been in business analysis for like 10 to 15 years now. I've kind of lost track, and I still will have people come to my courses sometimes and ask me, have you heard of blah, 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 and they'll say some term, and I'll be like, gosh, that sounds like it might be like this. Is that what you're looking at? Or do you mean this in an alternative term? And there's just so much terminology in the profession and so much inconsistency in terms of how terminology is used. Like, we don't expect our hiring managers just to use terminology in the interview that comes right from the BABAP guide or right from any resource from business analysis. Like, there's just a wide variety of ways that people talk about these techniques. And so it's okay for you to clarify unclear questions. Again, it's better than saying no, right? It's like, oh no, I've never heard of that. You could say, well, that, if you put the words together and try to interpret it, do you mean something like this? So in the example of the wireframe, when somebody had said wireframe, he could have been like, in the context of the conversation, like, do you mean workflow diagram, or do you mean maybe more of a user interface model, right? And even if neither of those are right, you still are probably going to get more information from that person and have a conversation, and then maybe it'll trigger something in your mind that you can share. And then another way to do this would be like, could you give me, I'm really not sure, that's a term I'm unfamiliar with, but I've done a lot of the things that we've been talking about in the interview today. Would you mind giving me an example of how your BAs do that, or how that's used as part of your business analysis process, right? And again, you're just asking for a little bit more information, and that could not, sometimes that might not work, right? You might have an interviewer be like, well, no, you should just know this. But like, the words, it's better than saying no. It's better than just saying, oh, I have no idea. And it could lead to something where you can then share some relevant experience and really get past a question that otherwise you would essentially not meet a requirement for. And the other thing that keep in mind is sometimes as a hiring manager, especially when I was hiring for more senior level roles, I would deliberately ask unclear questions. And that might sound a little bit like, what? Why would you do that? But I knew that I needed business analysts and project managers who were going to be able to interact with higher level stakeholders. And those higher level stakeholders were not always super clear about what they would say the first time. They would kind of like say, oh, abstract business need, right? Oh, we just need to make a better customer experience. And I knew I needed people that were confident enough to push back on higher level stakeholders. And so if I would ask an unclear question or say something kind of deliberately vague in an interview, and that person was confident enough to push back on me as an interviewer or ask me a clarifying question, right, then I was getting evidence right there that they were ready to succeed in the kind of environment that we were succeeding in. So never assume that your interviewer is actually looking for the answer or the perfect answer to that question. Sometimes they're actually looking for something a lot different than what they're directly asking for as well. So with that, Marlena, I know we wanted to take a few questions here along the way just to kind of see like where people are at, how I can expand on these things and make sure we're really solving the problems to solve. And then, of course, we'll move on to the next couple of mistakes as well.
Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions. You have answered a few of them along the way. But I'm going to start with back at the career map. We had a question regarding there's a gentleman who is 35 now and working in digital advertising and wants to know, is it too late for him to restart his career as a BA, and how and where should I start?
Okay, well, great question. I think we had the first part of that question on our last webinar, but it was like somebody who was in their 60s, right? And our answer was still like, no, like you can restart your career anytime you'd like. So 35 is definitely like young on the scale, and you have plenty of time to shift your career, and I'd be surprised if you don't shift your career a couple of times between now and retirement. So definitely feel empowered to get started with that. And then what was the second part of the question? I got caught up on the first part.
It's actually, we've had a couple more coming in asking where should I start for BA? They may have not necessarily have it's not a BA title, but they've worked doing some BA work. Where can they start to start their career as a BA?
Yeah. So the first thing that you really want to do is, and this is the pieces that you take with you on the journey, which is your transferable skills assessment. And this plays well into the interview, because the better you understand how the experience you already have relates to business analysis and the business analysis profession and the types of jobs you see, the more roles that you'll be able to apply for. So most of the roles that we see are not entry-level roles. They require 3 to 5 years of experience. But a lot of people that are trying to transition to the profession have been doing this kind of work under a different job title with maybe less formal documentation. But you can really start to look and say, maybe out of the last 6 years, I've been doing this for a couple of years, and I can speak to a couple of years of actual experience that's relevant. So I always recommend starting with that assessment first and really appreciating the value of your skills and experience. And then that's going to tell you where to go on the roadmap. So are you in a current position where you can start expanding your skills, doing more business analysis? That tends to lead to a nice little virtual cycle of one BA experience leading to another. Or if you're not in an office setting, you're looking to be getting employed in an office setting, whether that's in a BA role or possibly a transitional role, and then you're going to be starting to do more of those BA tasks. That's like a crash course on the roadmap, and again, there's that free course on my website that walks you through this in a lot more detail that I would recommend starting with if you're in that position.
So then as an interviewer, what weighting or preferences would you give to applicants where, say, a candidate has a formal BA qualification compared to another candidate that has no BA-specific qualifications but has strength in soft skills? When given the choice, what weight? Is it how they produce themselves to you, or what weighting would you do?
Yeah, and so I'm taking it as a manager asking that question, right? So it really, I think as managers, we have to do essentially business analysis on our business analyst roles. So what are the most important requirements, and how do those serve our organization? And for me, when I was a hiring manager, we were not, as I mentioned, in a really super formal environment. So I was more concerned with people who could communicate really well. It was a very fast-paced environment. There was a lot of stakeholder interaction. We had to work with, multiple different stakeholders on everything that we were doing and get them aligned. And so for me, that communication skill was more important than a specific kind of documentation, because I knew I could train on the documentation. But ideally, I was looking for both, right? So you really have to look at what is that role and why are those different requirements important, and then who is going to be the best fit for your organization, who can you train into the role if there's not a perfect fit. So you've got to kind of do that analysis on your BA role.
Perfect. I'm going to move on to mistake number 1. Was it mistake 1? Let's see. For example, you were giving examples of questions that may be asked. There's 2. What should you say when asked, tell me about yourself? I know we're moving on to that after.
Yeah.
But in regards to proprietary or confidential processes, any tips on how to give specific examples without being too specific, but not too generic?
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. So, and you don't have, if an interviewer is actually, if you're interviewing with a competitor of your prior organization, and an interviewer is pressing you for very specific details that would be considered proprietary, I would consider that a red flag. It's not ethical, but it's not uncommon for people to try to interview people to gain proprietary information. And so you don't want to do that, right? And it could be one of those scenarios where they're testing your propriety. They just want to see if you're going to leak something, and that would be a trust issue and almost lead not to being hired, right? So you really want to judge that situation. But you want to be able to talk, it's more about the kinds of people that you're working with, the kinds of documentation, and the kinds of scenarios. So you wouldn't have to say like, oh, Susie from accounting said this, and when we use XYZ system, we added this specific field. Like, you don't have to get into like the actual details of the requirements. You more want to talk about it at a process level. And if there is a case where you're like, where you feel like you're treading into something that you shouldn't share, be like, you can take a second and pause and say, hey, I feel like there's some proprietary information here. I just want to think about how I can frame this in a way where I can share that experience with you and not go into details I shouldn't have, and just ask essentially for that permission to have that minute to think that through and then jump into it. Or just say like, hey, if they're really asking a question that you feel is too much detail, like I don't feel like it would be great to share that information. It would be disingenuous to my previous or current employer. Like, is there something else I could share with you that would help you feel confident about my experience and my ability to work well here, right? So turn it back to them to try to redirect that conversation.
Perfect.
Great one.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe one more, and then we'll go on to number 4.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How would you describe your typical day at work as a business analyst? So it's a very general question.
Yeah, I used to love to ask that question. And one of the answers that I loved hearing was because it was one of those where I was asking the question that didn't really have the right answer, right? So I was often looking for people to say, like, well, there isn't a typical day, right? All of my days are different. And here are some of the more typical things I do, and be able to talk about the meetings that they were facilitating, the kinds of independent work that they would do, the kinds, were they responding? I was kind of looking too for, were they the kind of person that was responding to what was coming up, or were they the kind of person that was proactively out managing their day and figuring out how to move a project forward? Because you could kind of pick up really quickly if they're like, well, I come in and I check my email and I see what I need to respond to today, and then my whole day gets dictated around that, versus, oh, I'm facilitating a meeting I scheduled, I'm looking ahead at what I need to accomplish within the next week, I'm preparing documents for the meeting that I have the next day. And, so that you're really often just looking for kind of that pattern of work that you have, and that appreciation that there really is no typical day usually for a BA. They're a lot different. They can be very different.
That is true.
Great question. Okay. So, and we are going to talk about the tell me about yourself question, so I will save that one for last. And we're going to have more time for questions at the end, too. And these are great questions, so keep getting them in, specifics that you've come up across in your career, or just other questions that you're like, what would I do with this one? But let's kind of talk towards the end of the interview and the mistake of not having questions to ask. And this has come up a lot, and most interviewers will ask you if you have questions, and definitely have some ready. Because as business analysts, we are judged as much by our questions as our answers, right? This is our job, is we go into stakeholder meetings and we ask a bunch of questions. And so if you show up to an interview without questions, that's going to be a red flag to somebody who's interviewing for a BA. Ideally, if you use some of the approaches that we've talked about so far, you've been asking questions all throughout, and it's been very conversational. It hasn't felt like you peppering the hiring manager with questions. So they already are going to have that feel, but you should still have a couple ready at the end as well. This demonstrates you've done your research, that you're curious, that you really care about the position. The other thing questions do is they demonstrate that you were listening during the interview. So another related mistake here that I've had people do is, like, they would ask, I would always start with a little bit of information about the job, and then as we went through the interview, I would usually provide some more information about the job related to the questions I was asking. And every once in a while, I'd have somebody like ask me a question at the end of the interview that I had answered like during the interview, and it was just because it was on their list, right? And that was like always kind of just like, well, wait, I answered that question. Like, weren't you listening to me? And a lot of times I would give people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt around things like that because it is an interview situation. It can feel like a lot of pressure, can feel like you really, it can be harder to listen, but then it's so important that you're able to show up that way in an interview and truly listen to what's going on and turn it into a conversation, because that's what's going to have to happen in your stakeholder interviews. And again, that goes to that confidence and that communication that we're looking for, especially for a mid to senior level business analyst. Entry level, you might expect people to be a little bit more intimidated by the interviewing process and by interviewing high-level stakeholders. Once you're in a mid-level, especially senior-level BA position, you really need to be able to handle those situations, and the interview is where you're demonstrating that you can handle it, not just even what, it's how you handle the interview itself. So yeah, you're demonstrating that you listened. Another mistake that I've seen people make is just really asking too many questions, right? So like you can ask too many questions. Like, you want to show you're curious, you want to show you care. You also want to show that you can read the situation. So if people start to like look at their watch or be like, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have a ton of time. What's your most important question? Or what can I definitely answer for you? Don't use that as the opportunity to like, well, 5 questions, right? And like not kind of respect that boundary that they've set. And usually that was when I was kind of ready to walk away from a candidate anyways, and so I don't know why those were always the candidates that had like, just like 5 or 10 questions, and it would just go on and on and on and on. And be sure to acknowledge, too, the answers. So this goes back to that listening. So instead of like one question, letting them answer, and then moving right to your next question, again, make it a conversation. Oh, I see what you're saying about that, or rephrase back what you heard, show that you understood, and maybe ask a follow-up to drill in or kind of connect your questions together so that it doesn't just seem like you peppering them with questions at the end. And again, you're starting to build that relationship that when you do move into that job, you've already created a really solid foundation with that person about the position. See, so let's talk about mistake number 5, and this is like the tell me about yourself, or any sort, and it's not always this exact question. Sometimes it's like, hey, just tell me a little bit about you and your career, or, would you just kind of like get me started? Tell me, there's some general question, and most interviews are going to start with this kind of a question, and most people are unprepared for it. I know even though I was an interviewer, I was kind of unprepared for this question the first time it was asked to me. Like, I thought I would just be able to make it up on the fly, right? And this is where I really do think some rehearsal is helpful, because our kind of general tendency is to start way back in the beginning and give a lot of detail and kind of start to ramble on. And, you could go on for 5 minutes easily and never actually share the information that the interviewer cares about. And, I've been in these where somebody like starts from the beginning of their career, and I'm just like, okay, let's get to the relevant stuff. Let's get to the relevant stuff. Let's get to the relevant stuff. So really think about going into that interview based on the research you've done for the position and for that person. Like, what are the details you think they're going to care most about? You don't have to talk about your whole career. Like that, this question isn't like start from, the day you were born or start from your first job. It's really about what could you summarize for your key qualifications, or your key reasons for being a business analyst, or your key reasons for being interested in this position. Like, really hone this in to just a couple of minutes of key information about you and your career. Because the interview might be short, right? You don't want to take up 10 minutes of a 15-minute interview talking about information that's not relevant to the interviewer and then not have time to really answer their most important questions. And the hardest part, which is still hard for me even when I'm like presenting and everything around a question, is to actually finish it, right? So actually be done, because then you'll be like, oh, wait, I want to share one more thing. So rehearse your couple of minutes, and I like to do this like on the drive to the interview, right? I say it a couple of times, and I think about what that position is and what the most relevant experiences I can share. Again, you want to speak to your experience, your qualifications, and your interest for the position. And then turn it back to them. Hey, I know I shared a lot of information there. What would you like to hear more about? Or what questions can I answer for you, right? So then you're really inviting them to ask more about the pieces that are relevant to them. And it might be like, oh, hey, you mentioned this really big project that you did recently. Like, could you tell me a little bit more about what your typical day was like there, or what your business analysis process was like, right? And so then you're helping to guide them into questions related to your experience too. And so, definitely prepare an answer, and definitely end it with a question, and don't let it go on and on and on and on, because otherwise you'll kind of never be done. So with that, these are the few things I wanted to make sure we talk about. So we have lots of time for questions.
Perfect. So we do have, there was one question, and we haven't quite touched on it. It's to get in the door. Do you have any tips on resume writing when you have unofficial BA and PM experience? How would you mark your resume to show that you do have it, but unofficially?
Yeah, I take challenge with the word unofficially. So I think that we think of it as unofficial, where this is, again, giving yourself license to use the terminology that employers are using. So what about that makes it unofficial to you, and use the terms? So, I mean, you don't want to lie and mislead, but you don't have to use the terms that is what you are using. You can use, functional requirements to talk about an informal document that documented what the software was supposed to do. You can use wireframe or mockup or prototype really to talk about all the same words that you use to design and show what a user interface would look like. So that's how you get in the door, is presenting that experience and not trying to back away from it and being like, well, it was unofficial. I don't know what makes it official versus official. It's not having the job title. It's not having used the terms. It's just having done the work. And so present your work in the best possible light, and that's really the gateway to get more of those opportunities and get your resume, so that you can show up in the interview and talk about those specific examples that we talked about in the beginning.
Right. Another question is, as we look for jobs, what are examples of titles that are synonymous with business analysis?
Yeah, I'm going to pull up my book, actually, because I have a whole list in here somewhere. Let's see if I can find it real quickly. Some that come to mind are obviously project manager, business process analyst, sometimes systems analyst, sometimes project analyst. It's more, what I think things to do is look for those keywords in the job posting, and it does tend to be a little bit hit or miss. Functional analyst is another one that comes to mind, and especially functional analyst around a specific software that you might have experience with. So start with those and see what else comes up, and follow the threads. Yeah.
Perfect. And learn how to say the word synonymous. Another question is, how many questions would be too many questions to ask your interviewer?
Yeah, I would say start with a couple and go from there. And again, it's not about like there being a right number. For some, like 2 questions might be too many. They might, you're going to see like that they're ready to walk out the door, right? For some, like it might be that if you didn't have 5, right, it's not enough, right? Because they really are interested in you and want to make sure that you're answering all your questions. And also be cognizant when it comes to questions of what the next step in that interview is. So, and that can be a great question to ask too, right? What's the next step from here? And then what do I need? Make sure your questions are around that. So if there's going to be another interview, before that position, like before they make the final decision, then you probably don't want to ask all the like nitty-gritty details about the offer and the specifics of that, right? Because you're going to have another interview where you can ask those questions. But questions about the environment and about how the BA process works and what the next step is and was there anything that I missed, that kind of thing can always be good ones. So it's about gauging the situation for sure.
Perfect. Mistake number 4 is brought to mind for someone note-taking during an interview. Do you recommend?
Yeah, I am a compulsive note taker personally. In an interview, though, that I would say when it comes to the questions, you might do it there. I think that can throw some people off if you were doing it in the interview. You might want to have paper with you because some people might throw a scenario at you where you would need paper. You want to show you're prepared for a lot of different things. But yeah, it's mostly going to be you sharing information. So, be really clear. If it's something that you're promising to give or something that you want to research, hey, I'm just going to take a quick note on that. But I wouldn't sit there and constantly be scribbling notes because it's more about you sharing information with them. And hopefully they're taking notes, right? They should be the one taking notes in that interview situation.
Right. In regards to the tell me about yourself question, are there any details that you think are a necessity to talk about yourself?
Yeah, so what I would suggest starting with is, a recap of your experience. So, hey, I've been a business analyst for 5 years, 10 years, or I've been in the software industry, or I've been in this kind of project environment. If you don't feel like you can say I've been a business analyst for this many years, and I've worked at these companies, maybe really quickly list them. And here's one of the more interesting projects I've done recently that's relevant to the position or what I think that you're looking for in the position. And so I think just that quick snapshot of your career to kind of give somebody that frame of reference and then talking about a few of your experiences. Is really what's important. You might share any recent training or credentials too, though I think often when people are asking that question, they more want to hear about kind of what companies you worked for, what kind of roles you had, what kind of projects you worked on. And so jumping into that kind of detail is going to often be more interesting.
Perfect. And what about experience prior to being a business analyst, that maybe the skills that haven't been used recently? Should those be mentioned in an interview or a resume?
Yeah, definitely on your resume. So your resume, unless they go too far back, if you have 30, 40 years of experience, you don't need to list the stuff that you did 30 years ago on your resume prior to being a BA, right? So, use some judgment with that. But yeah, your resume should have that catalog at least of, whether it's a couple of years if you're new or 15 to 20 years if you're not as new, so that there's a good depth of experience there. And it's showing all of it. Now, you're not going to talk as much in your resume about those earlier positions, but you can bring focus to them as needed. So if there's something that you've done in your past experience before becoming a BA that you haven't done as a BA but is relevant to that job posting that you're applying for, definitely make sure that's called out in your resume as well so that people can see the story and make sure all those qualifications are covered. Now, in the interview, for sure, if it's, you always want to choose examples to share from your most relevant and recent experience. So use that as a filter, right? But if your most relevant, and recent experience could be 10 years ago. It doesn't mean it has to be within the last year. And if that's how far you have to go back in order to present something that's relevant to what they're asking about, then for sure, talk about it. And the other thing to say there is when you are doing that, one of the mistakes that can be made is really what that first interviewer that I talked about made, where she would say, oh yeah, I did that 10 years ago, or I did that in this job, right? But she like you have to kind of do the work to go back in time and really remember some of the details around that. And it might not be, it's not going to be all the specifics and all the nitty-gritty details, but to at least be able to speak to it so that it isn't like, oh, this person did, you don't want that interviewer to feel like, oh, it's been a long time since they've done it. It should really feel like you've done it recently and are, more importantly, just ready to do it again, right? That's what they in a way don't care about the length. They care about, are you ready to do this in my environment if I were going to hire you tomorrow? And that's why they're asking that question. So that's what you want your answer to satisfy for them.
Perfect. You spoke about doing a little bit of research before you're going into an interview on BA terminology. A question regarding that aspect. So understanding BA terminology is one thing, but understanding industry terminology is another. So how much effort should be put into understanding industry-specific terminology?
That's a great question, because if it's in the job posting, most likely they are going to be looking for industry experience. And so if you're not from that industry, first of all, so the first barrier you might face is getting your resume approved, like getting the interview in the first place, right? So, and I'm not sure if you're asking that question kind of having gotten through that hoop of the interview, getting to the interview based on your resume. So the first hoop, just for anybody who's listening though, and been like, well, I've been applying to those jobs that have all those industry terms, and why am I not hearing back? So a lot of times when those jobs have those industry terms, they're only looking for people with that experience. If you're not presenting that experience on your resume, you're not going to ever get to the interview process, and so you won't have to worry about it in the interview, quite frankly. And that's just a filter that organization has applied, and we could debate whether that's right for their BA practice, but as a candidate, it's hard to get past that filter. Now, if you do get past that filter because you are able to demonstrate relevant experience or related experience, or possibly they just can't find everyone who meets all of their qualifications, right, and you've gotten an interview for a job that you don't have the industry experience listed in the resume, then you have to believe there's a reason that you got that interview. There's a reason, there's something that they saw in what the qualifications you presented that led them to say, we want to talk to this person. They don't quite meet the requirements we're looking for, but we want to talk to them anyways. And I would do a little bit of research there, but you're not going to become an industry expert overnight, right? You're not going to learn what people have probably gone to school and been in that industry years to learn. And so the confidence that you go in there with is that there's a reason that they hired you, and if they really do, or that they interviewed you, sorry, if they go into that and they start asking you about all those, and it's like, what are your thoughts on whatever, industry-specific term or philosophy or something, you can speak to the research you did. You can use your questioning skills to figure some of that out. Be like, I'm new to the profession or this industry. You probably knew that when you decided to interview me. I don't have a lot of that background. Let's talk about that issue. And you demonstrate how you would lead an elicitation session around that kind of thing, and how you would draw that information out from your stakeholders in order to guide them, even while you are the person in the room who knows the least about the industry. And then if that's not enough, it's not enough, because they're really looking for something else. But there's no way to become that industry expert overnight. So great question. There's a lot of facets to that one.
Another question regarding examples and giving specific examples. So when you're giving your specific example, is it all right to bring in documented samples, like bringing in a workflow diagram that you had worked on previously?
Yeah. I think, you can bring that out as, it's another thing where you want to gauge your interviewer's desires there. You could, especially if they ask a specific question, you could say, hey, I've got an example of that. Let's talk through it. What you don't want to do is have that work sample try to stand for itself. So because it's so easy to look at a requirements document or a workflow diagram and be like, gosh, this isn't how we do it at our organization, or this is totally different, or I don't know what this means, or kind of like pick it apart based on it standing alone. You really want to present it with context and speak to it and use it as just kind of an example, not just like, oh, I've done a workflow diagram, here you go, and kind of let that work stand alone. You still want to make sure that you're speaking to it. And another thing on work samples is I really don't recommend sending them without context unless you're absolutely kind of pinned into a corner to do that. You always want to be able to show that work sample and talk about that work sample and talk about why you created that document and how it fit into the process for that project, and maybe even areas where you would have improved or things that you didn't do because of certain constraints, right? And so instead of allowing that kind of independent assessment of it, where people are like, oh, they totally missed this section, like why didn't they do that? Or, this doesn't look like we would do it, like why did they do that, right? All kinds of negatives can come up if you're not telling the story and framing the story and there to answer questions. So you really want, if you're going to use work samples, to be presenting them and not just kind of throwing them over and say, hey, take a look and let me know what you think, because often that's not going to work in your favor.
Perfect. So we have about 5 minutes left, so I have 3 more questions. And a comment for you from Jessica. She says, I have had several interviews recently, and I wish I had listened to this webinar about 3 months ago. I am fortunate to be starting my new job next week, but I would have done better in interviews had I listened to this webinar first.
Oh, Jessica, well, congratulations on starting your new job. That's super, super exciting. And I'm glad this resource is here for those who it is hitting at exactly the right time.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get to our last 3. In regarding to within your interview, when the interviewer had asked you if you have any questions, what do you think protocol should be? Should you come up with a question even though you may not necessarily have one at the top of your head? Is it okay not to ask a question when the interviewer asks you if you have any?
Yeah, this is one of the things we cover in the prep guide. Like, you should prepare those questions before you walk in. So yes, you should have questions. You should be thinking about them before you go in. You should have more than you need so that if they get answered in the interview, you can ask the ones that weren't answered. And a good go-to is always like, what's the next step from here?
Perfect.
I feel like I'm doing lightning round, right? Because we're towards the end here.
The last 2 questions are kind of on par with ending the webinar. It's regarding after your interview. So, well, actually, before you finish your interview, can you suggest a strong ending to an interview? And then what would the protocol be for after an interview? Is it okay to send a thank you note, or can you follow up to see if they had anything else that they needed?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, provided it's like up to you. Usually it's the interviewer kind of ending the interview, and they're going to say something like, thank you for your time today, I'll be in touch with next steps, or kind of hand you over to the next person, right? A lot of times as BAs we interview with multiple people, but that's just a chance for you to express like gratitude for the person, thank you for your time, reinforce that you're interested in the position. If you are, if you're not, like, it's okay to go to an interview and be like, I don't want this position. You would still say thank you for your time and we'll be in touch, right? But if you are really interested, say, thank you for your time. I'm really interested in next steps. I can't wait to learn more about the opportunity, and I could really see myself working in your organization, or something that just has that confidence and really expresses to them your interest in taking the next step. And then definitely after the interview, sending a thank you note or a thank you email is great. I think it's underdone in today's society to actually put something physical in the mail, and it does allow you to stand out. So if you can get a thank you note in the mail to that person, even I've heard of people dropping them off like on the way out of the interview so that it shows up within a day or two. And it helps you stay present in mind. It's another trigger for them to be like, oh, right, I talked to that person. And just reinforce again that your gratitude for the time, your interest in the position, and maybe, recap an experience or something that, you were glad to be able to speak to, or how you could see yourself contributing to the organization. that can definitely increase your chances of moving to the next step with that person.
Wonderful. So I think that's it.
Awesome. And we are right on time. That's amazing. Thank you for all the great questions and the great feedback from today's session. I wish you all the best of luck on your next interview and rocking it and not making any of these mistakes. So.
And thank you to you, Laura, for all your insight on how to make the BA job interview a little easier the next time. And thank you to all of you for joining us. The webinar will be posted on our webinar archives within 5 business days if you want to relook, as well as the presentation. And with that, have a great day, afternoon, and evening.